Hello. Today we'll be talking about psychoanalytic criticism, one of the most important and fundamentally necessary schools of criticism that we use in literary studies even today. There was a time when the human mind was considered a mystery, but today much has been learned about the way our brains function. Sigmund Freud, a Viennese doctor, is considered one of the most important pioneers of modern psychology. By studying the unconscious, he laid the groundwork for psychoanalysis. While practicing medicine in the 1880s, more than, let's say, 130 or 40 years ago, he found out that he could help hysterical patients by having them remember traumatic incidents they faced, especially during their childhood. He also developed the technique of free association, whereby patients could talk about emotionally charged aspects of their lives. Freudian theory, although often criticized for its emphasis on sexuality, has deeply influenced anthropology, education, art, and of course, literature. Today, the literary critic using psychology or psychoanalysis can base their inferences, or let's say principles, on the works of numerous important theorists. But it is Freud's ideas that have provided the basis for this approach, and his ideas are still fundamental to it. Whether you are directly applying Freudian theory or working with the ideas of his followers, it is necessary to understand some of the most important principles that were laid by Freud, and you will see that what Freud did was basically trying to explain the working of the human psyche. It would be wrong to suggest that Freud's ideas never changed. In fact, his ideas changed during his own lifetime as he developed them. For example, in the beginning, Freud declared that our minds were a dichotomy consisting of the conscious, that is to say the rational, and the unconscious, let's say the irrational. He later revised his theory, believing that no thought was either totally conscious or totally unconscious, and he spoke rather of modes of consciousness or unconsciousness. His thoughts and theories are mostly considered as speculative and controversial. We also have to remember that Freud was affected from other, let's say, psychologists. For instance, he applied hypnosis with Brewer to their hysteric patients. As I've mentioned before, he also developed free association as a technique and used talking, just talking, as a cure. Most probably, that's why when you go to a shrink, a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they talk. And this talk is a gift given to the field of psychology and psychiatry by Freud. Speaking of which, we should talk about the unconscious. Now, unconscious is the storehouse, in Turkish, a depot of our painful experiences and emotional wounds and sorrowful bearings that we carry with us throughout our lives, our fears, our guilty desires, and unresolved conflicts. We do not want to know details about these. We do not really want to think about those, let's say, fears that we have. But the fact that we do not want to remember them, we do not want to talk about them, is because we feel that we will be overwhelmed by them. Because childhood is the root cause of all of our present identity, family plays an important role in Freudian psychology. Because for Freud, we are the products of our families. Probably one of the most significant aspects of Freudian theory is the primacy of the unconscious, hidden from the conscious mind, which Freud compared to that small portion of an iceberg that is visible above the surface of the water. The unconscious is like the powerful, unseen mass below it. Because the unconscious mind is aware, and to say it more correctly, because the conscious mind is not aware of its submerged counterpart, it may be mistaken to understand by thinking rationally as human beings on our own the real causes of our behavior or feelings. An individual may be unable to tell the difference between what is happening now and what they think is happening. In short, our actions are the result of forces we do not recognize and therefore, unfortunately, cannot control. As I have mentioned before, Freud's view of the human mind can be likened to an iceberg. The tip is seen, but the bottom is not. So, the tip refers to the conscious level. That is to say, our thoughts, our perceptions, our ideas, the things we say about ourselves, and so on. At the subconscious level, we have the memories, experiences, and the stored knowledge that come from our past experiences. But the unconscious level is the most important part. At the unconscious level, our fears, violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, and our selfish needs are stored. In an effort to describe the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious mind, Freud divided the human psyche into three major parts: the id, the superego, and the ego. They are, for the most part, unconscious. The id, for example, is completely unconscious. Only small parts of the ego and the superego are conscious. Each operates according to different, even contrasting principles. Let's explain how our ids, superegos, and egos interact in our daily lives. To exemplify our ids, we say, for instance, I want that right now. For instance, let's say we want a big, a very big hamburger or a huge pizza. Whether or not we are hungry or we need to eat something, but we want that hamburger or pizza. But maybe we need to lose weight, or we have a high level of cholesterol, or worse, we do not have money to buy that hamburger or pizza. So our superego comes into play and says to our ids, yes, you want that pizza or hamburger, but you are not supposed to eat it because you are getting fat or because you have no money. And finally, the decisive part is our egos. The ego balances the desires of the id and the rule-based functioning of the superego. And thus, the ego says, well, let's figure out a way to work together. Let's solve this problem. Maybe not a hamburger, but a few apples, or just a slice of pizza, and something like that. So in that sense, our minds are, at any single moment in our daily lives, experience the interplay of our ids, superegos, and egos. When you compare and contrast Freud's tripartite or three systems of personality, we see that they sometimes overlap and they sometimes work in opposition. Let's start talking about the id. Now, the id represents our biological beings. It works at the level of the unconscious. It seeks pleasure and it tries to avoid pain or sorrow. And it wants immediate gratification. Whenever it wants something, it wants it to be done. However, the superego represents the societal, familial, or parental aspect, which includes religious beliefs and values and norms that are shared in a given society. The superego works at the level of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. In that sense, it is rather more complex when it comes to its working. Unlike the id, which works within the principle of pleasure, the superego is moralistic and idealistic. It represents and works within the mode of that dichotomy between right and wrong, good and bad, religiously acceptable or not, and it desires perfection. That is to say, the superego wants the individual to be a perfect member of society. And the poor ego, it represents the psychological aspect of the psyche. Similar to the superego, it works at the level of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And unlike the id and the superego, it works within the mode of reality. It is aware of what the individual desires and what the external world may give or may reject individuals to experience such desires. The purpose of the ego is to adapt to reality while controlling the id and the superego. In that sense, the ego seeks safety, compromise, and delayed gratification. Let's talk about the id some more, because it's a very important segment of our psyche. The id can be called the primitive I. It is the repository of the libido, the source of our psychic energy and our psychosexual desires, which gives us our vitality. Because our id is always trying to satisfy its hunger for pleasure, it operates without any thought of consequences. Anxiety, ethics, logic, precaution, or even morality. Demanding quick and swift satisfaction and fulfillment of biological desires, the id is lawless, asocial, amoral. As Freud described it, the id strives to bring about the satisfaction of the instinctual needs subject to the observances that work within the pleasure principle. Because our ids work for pleasure, disregarding the laws, rules, regulations, it can be a socially destructive force. Unrestrained, it will aggressively seek to gratify its desires without any concern for law, customs, or values. It can even be self-destructive in its drive to have what it wants. In many ways, it resembles the devil figure that appears in some theological or even literary texts, because it offers strong temptation to take what we want without heeding normal restraints, taboos, or consequences. Well, the id is chaotic. It is like a wild animal. What about the ego? In short, the ego is the balanced I. To prevent the chaos that would result if the id were to go untamed, uncontrolled, other parts of the psyche must balance its passions, desires. The ego, which operates according to the reality principle, is one such regulating agency. Its function is to make the id's energies non-destructive by delaying or diverting them into socially acceptable actions, sometimes by finding an appropriate time for gratifying them. Although it is for the most part unconscious, the ego is the closest of the three parts of the psyche to what we think of as consciousness, because it mediates between our inner selves and the external world. Nevertheless, it is not directly approachable. We come closest to knowing it when it is relaxed by hypnosis, sleep, or unintentional slips of the tongue. Dreams then become an important means of knowing what is hidden about ourselves from ourselves. The third part of the psyche, the superego, provides additional balance to the id. Similar to what is commonly known as one's conscience, in Turkish vicdan, it operates according to the morality principle, for it provides the sense of moral and ethical wrongdoing. Parents who enforce their values through punishments and rewards are the chief source of the superego, which furnishes a sense of guilt for behavior that breaks the rules given by the parents to the young child. Later in life, the superego is expanded by institutions and other influences, such as religions. Consequently, the superego works against the drive of the id and represses socially unacceptable desires back into the unconscious. Balance between the license of the id and the restrictions of the superego produces the healthy personality. Is it? We'll see. But when unconscious guilt becomes overwhelming, the individual can be said to be suffering from a guilt complex. When the superego is too strong, it can lead to unhappiness and dissatisfaction with the self. In conclusion, Freudian criticism uses the psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud to interpret a literary text in terms of the known psychological conflicts of its author, or conversely, to construct the author's psychic life from unconscious revelations in his work. That is to say, in psychoanalytic literary criticism, the researcher believes that at least the text tells us something about the author's inner conflicts. To understand that, as a researcher, then we have to understand the working of the human psyche, which is represented by the id, the ego, and the superego.